Hello everyone, good evening. I'm James Harding. I'm the editor and co-founder of Tortoise, and thank you for joining us for this conversation, which I suppose I should introduce with this thought. A fair few years ago now, in the 90s, I was a journalist in China, and one of my predecessors, a reporter who then worked for The Independent, called Andy Higgins, said there was a certain kind of story that journalists, particularly foreign correspondents in China, like to write. And he described it as, you know, the thing that you've never heard of, well, it's not happening. And I'd just written a story which the headline was Jiang Zemin's commitment to spiritual civilization is not taking off in the countryside. A perfect example of the thing you've never heard of is not happening. And I thought about that today when I thought about this thinking on COP26. Who are you kidding? Because I realized there's a story that's even worse than the thing you've never heard of, it's not happening, which is the thing that everyone's heard of, it's not happening. And the reason that we're hosting this conversation is that it's very easy in the UK, in a spirit of lockdown easing, wishful thinking, and an eye to COP26 and the possibility that something that happens in the UK, in Glasgow in November of this year, is truly consequential for the world. That we so want that to be the case that we're actually blind to the fact that the possibility of a meaningful Glasgow agreement is much further away than we like to think. And we at Tortoise are really focused on this. You can imagine from our name, Tortoise, you can imagine from the fact that we're a slow newsroom, from the fact we're interested in what's driving the news, not breaking news, that our planet matters deeply to us. And yet we're even worried at the extent to which we succumb to the idea that there's real momentum behind tackling climate change. We're hosting a climate summit in a few weeks' time, April the 27th. We've got a great group of people together, and this thinking is supposed to be a check on our thinking. It's supposed to force us to reckon with the extent to which we really are seeing commitments at a government level that will meaningfully contribute to tackling climate change. My colleague Barney McIntyre put together those slides that you saw at the beginning. We'll come back to those because I think they should give us all pause for thought. But I'm really, really grateful to Isabel Hilton, to Isabella Teixeira, and to Harjit Singh, because what I hope is between them, in the sort of opening section of this thinking, we can actually really address whether or not A, China, B, Brazil, and C, the countries of the world that are now increasing emitters are making meaningful contributions and are getting just to a meaningful agreement in Glasgow. So Isabel, if I might, I'm going to start with you. I'm hoping that people know the setup in thinking, which is weigh in with your thoughts, bring in your observations, I'll bring you into the conversation. But Isabel, why don't we start, if we might, with you? And it's very hard to get a read on China. What's your understanding of what the nature of China's commitment is on climate?
Yes, well, my take on China's commitment on climate would be that in the long term, it's very serious. And if you look back a decade, you can see that China has bet its industrial economy on low carbon technologies and therefore on there being a carbon constrained world. And that was an economic and industrial decision which was taken in all sobriety with the view to marshalling a suite of technologies that would help China get through the middle income trap, which is currently one of its main problems. So China understands climate change, it understands the threat to climate change, and it also sees the opportunity side of climate change. Where you can criticize China, and many do, is that in its first phase of the Industrial Revolution, that double-digit 20 years, it committed very heavily to coal as the primary fuel of that industrial revolution. Why? Because that's what China has. That is the energy source that China has in abundance. Everything else is either scarce or has to be imported. So if you're, concerned about energy security and you're concerned about availability, you go for coal. So having gone for coal to such a huge degree, rowing back an economy the size of China, and making that transition to a low carbon economy is a long, slow job. And it's a job that China has embarked upon. You can see the ratio of non-fossil fuels to fossil fuels is shifting. It's shifting quite slowly. And the question, I think, this year is how high up the agenda is it? The commitment is serious. They made a 2060 commitment, as we know, at the UN General Assembly last year. But the 14th five-year plan, which was unveiled in March, was pretty disappointing. And in that plan, the word security was mentioned around 70 times, and the climate commitment was mentioned just once. And that is a reflection of the way geostrategic tensions can upset domestic programs on climate change.
And Isabel, at the back end of last year, this is before the Biden election victory, so it must have been, I think, October. I was involved in a conversation, and John Kerry was there, and this was before Biden had won, and certainly before he'd been appointed to that climate czar role.
Yeah.
And it was quite striking. I don't know whether you ever heard John Kerry speak. He gets going, and you're like, where is this going? I'm not quite sure. And then he sort of launched into what actually was a really compelling case, and it's on my mind given his meetings on climate with the Chinese now. He made this really compelling case that the commitment China has made to net zero by 2060 is quite seductive, but it misses the point that China is now exporting its coal operations along the Belt and Road. And so there's now an intersection of greenhouse gas emissions with, if you like, influence and foreign policy. And I don't know whether or not that's a fair read that he had on China, but so I wonder what your reaction to that is.
No, it's not unfair. And China has, as I say, it's trying to reduce its commitments at home. People forget that China has politics. It is an authoritarian one-party state, but within that authoritarian one-party state, you have very recognizable pressures, anxieties about the economy, anxieties about security, anxieties about unemployment, millions of people involved in the coal industry. So when the Belt and Road was launched in 2013, the coal companies in China who could see a diminishing future in China saw it as a massive opportunity to prolong their life. And so they went out on the Belt and Road with state bank finance, with state support, and they essentially sold coal-fired power stations to lots of emerging economies. And the calculation is that if all the countries that have signed up to the Belt and Road, and that's about 170 at the moment, took the development path that China has taken, this involves doubling their emissions. China doubled its emissions in the first decade of this century. If they all did that, the game is completely over. There is absolutely no excuse to build new coal at this point. And I think China's pretty much out on a limb on that right now. I have to say, there was a report the other day which said that about 40% of new coal has actually been financed by Western institutions one way or another. The rest is largely China's. But Japan and South Korea were also big financiers of coal. They have said they won't anymore. So there's an opportunity there for China to make a commitment this year not to finance new coal on the Belt and Road. And perhaps they will make that commitment. It would be a decent offer.
And Isabel, I'm out of date on this. You mentioned the politics. What's the politics that was dominant probably 5 years ago? I think of it as the sort of the neo-imperialism of climate, i.e. the West, you've had your fridges and your cars and your plane rides. Now we in the East are getting our first taste of economic development, and you want to cut it off and use climate as the means of doing that. I know that argument has real hold in, for example, places like Indonesia or elsewhere. Is that a Chinese argument too, or has its stage of development moved beyond?
It has been a Chinese argument, but it began to fade out in around 2005 when China became the world's biggest emitter. And they realized that, you know, as one analyst put it, the tall poppy catches the wind, that it was going to be very difficult diplomatically for China, which was still positioning itself as a leader of G77, to you know, come across as the good guy when it was the world's biggest emitter. And there was a great moment in the Copenhagen COP, which ended in disaster. But when the leader of the High Ambition Group, which was a small Pacific island, so confronted China and said, "You are now our problem," and that was a kind of big moment for China. But at Paris, of course, there isn't this bifurcation between Annex 1 and non-Annex 1, so between developed and developing economies. Everyone brings to the table what they can bring to the table. And China uses that argument much less. You still hear it from India, but you know, China's per capita emissions are now the same as the European Union. So it's not like, you know, it's not like China is you know, is still developing or needs still to develop in terms of per capita emissions. It really, I think China understands that argument was running out of steam.
Okay, Isabel, thank you. I'm going to talk to Isabella and Harjin and come back and bring some people in. So thank you though for helping us get a grip on China. Isabella, I know that you know you are a former environment minister. You're engaged with the UN on this issue, and so you'll have a global view. But I wonder whether I can ask you to sort of talk about the situation in Brazil now. Isabel just mentioned that China has politics. Heaven knows Brazil at the moment has politics. What's your understanding of what a Bolsonaro government means for COP26?
Well, first of all, hello from Brazil. Thank you for inviting me to join you. And I was here carefully listening, hearing Isabel. And I also like to highlight here first that in Copenhagen COP, you have also the base group, okay? And this brought Brazil, South Africa, India, and China together. And this group was really important to achieve Paris Agreement. It's very important to understand better. Today, Brazil is not engaged in basic as it was in the past. And I don't know about the basic group dynamics, but what I'm saying here, that's very important to understand the next movements for the emerging economies and considering carbon footprint and ambition. And how you bring these different countries together, India, China, Brazil, and also South Africa, consider the net zero ambition and also how can raise ambition consider climate change implementation. But they were critical to achieve Paris Agreement. And I can share here that bilaterally Brazil had really good arrangements in the past together with China to achieve Paris Agreement and also bilaterally to move forward in cooperation consider climate change arrangements, together with the United States and also with Germany and Norway. This was part of our strategy in the past. Today, Brazil doesn't have this strategy, okay? This is my first point here. I'm not convinced that President Bolsonaro is a climate warrior. It's the opposite, in my opinion, okay? Because everything that his government put in practice the last 2 years means that have setbacks in our climate position. Brazil was one of the leaders to have on Paris Agreement. And more than this, we have ambition and disease. And today was launched early in Brazil, a scientific study showing that the new climate ambition in Brazil that was presented last December by the Minister of Environment, of course, Bolsonaro, means that Brazil, the new climate target of Brazil means that Brazil have backtracks and allows to increase deforestation in this NDC's proposal. These are the really numbers, the concrete numbers that we have on the table. Today, you have these situations that Mr. Biden is looking for to have an open debate and also to be back, United States to be back to the climate leadership and invite Brazil, as other countries, to join in the climate summit next week to present efforts or ambitions or actions to address solutions on climate change and climate ambition. And for Brazil, it's critical for this because Brazil has a unique situation. It's a trick situation that sometimes is very difficult to understand. You have economic carbon that you need to solve like agriculture, and Brazil has all the technologies to manage low carbon agriculture. So what will be the ambition of agriculture in Brazil in the next 30 years to address climate change? And the next week, the Minister of Agriculture will present a new plan for the next 10 years based on mitigation, adaptation, agriculture sector. This is the economic carbon, but you have no economic carbon for illegal deforestation in Amazonia. And this today is around 43% of Brazil emissions. So Bolsonaro government must address or tackle deforestation. And unfortunately, all the public policy that he adopted the last 2 years promote the rates of deforestation in Brazil. So I'm not sure if Brazil, I'm sure that Brazil doesn't have the credibility that it used to have in the past to go into the international meeting to offer actions and they ask money or funds to move forward without present concrete measures that will stop the setbacks and bring something really new that can show that Brazil will review the public policy that Bolsonaro adopted the last 3 years.
And Isabella, you remind me of another bad journalistic trait, which is to discuss the things that we do understand that don't matter, and to avoid discussing the things that we don't understand that do matter. So I think I can understand the issue of, what kind of dynamic there is diplomatically between these new great powers, Brazil and China and India and South Africa, etc. And I suppose I'll be able to judge what kind of momentum there is. I don't really understand the deforestation point because I don't really understand who measures that carbon impact, whether it's run by the Brazilian government, whether the UN only uses national measurements of those emissions. How do we as kind of normal people have confidence in the numbers that are committed and then the implementation on those numbers?
Okay, first of all, I think it's important to highlight here that Brazil has a huge scientific capacity on land use and also climate change. It's impressive. You have really important scientists and scientific institutions that are in charge, that were in charge, that are in charge to measure everything in Brazil with transparency and also to share these outcomes, inventories, etc. with UNFCCC. We have this one. And we have also, it's very important to observe here, that we have also from civil society, important mechanisms and tools like map biomes that monitor with transparency every day what is happening today concerning carbon emissions, not only in deforestation, but also in all economic sectors. Right. So we can go into the site, you can check these numbers, and these numbers are really close with the scientific numbers, okay? Because we have knowledge,
and forgive me, those NGO numbers or action group numbers and the scientific numbers, how do they correspond to the official government numbers?
The official government numbers, they're based on scientific numbers from one institution, that's National Institution for Aerospatial Research, that's in charge to offer these numbers. Okay? It used to be the last 30 years. And the government cannot go into that. Okay, even Bolsonaro, they try to go against the institutions, but to have official rates that is robust and he is not able to destroy this. This rate says what? That Bolsonaro policies are promoting the rates of deforestation today in Brazil.
Right, okay.
And you can monitor, because you have different dynamics to have the rate of deforestation. You have annual rate of deforestation, you have greenhouse gas inventory that you have to share with the UNFCCC, and you have this independent monitoring that under the responsibility of civil society that you can check the numbers. It's impressive how this will, the last 10 years, we perform very well, consider the civil society engagement to control or to support public policy, to review public policy. So Bolsonaro tried to go against everything. Right. And I'm so sorry, this will really not well succeed. Okay, what is clear for us, as I mentioned, we have a scientist now today that published a study saying that if you go into the update of the NDC, Brazil NDCs last December, what this allows? It allows the rates of deforestation. So Bolsonaro is saying that he wants to protect Amazonia, but the official tool under the UNFCCC shows that Brazil could move the rates of deforestation and not reduce deforestation and not raise ambition to cut carbon emissions.
Right.
So we have contradictions all the time with transparency, because we have our institutions, powerful institutions, civil society, we're working hard, showing that this doesn't make sense. Please sit at the table. Let's have an open dialogue to understand how Brazil can be back, because Brazil in the past was able to reduce 8% of our deforestation in Amazonia. It was the most important contribution of carbon emissions in the world. And you know how to do this. Bolsonaro is against to do this.
Okay, and then Isabella, let me just understand one thing, which is, I asked Isabella about the Belt and Road. I'm interested in the hemisphere and Biden and Bolsonaro, right? Yeah. By the way, I'm glad you laughed. The serious element to this is whether or not there's a genuine prospect that the Biden administration goes to Bolsonaro and says, look, we all have a shared interest in reducing the deforestation in the Amazon, and we, the US, are willing to put, financial resources behind it. I know there's a lot of speculation about this. I just don't know what's true.
Okay, what we have today? You know that we have a robust diplomatic tradition between Brazil and the United States. And President Biden made a movement, important political movement, to invite Brazil to join the summit. President Biden didn't put Brazil apart.
Right.
And open a bilateral dialogue, a formal one, okay, a diplomatic one. And Bolsonaro named the Minister of Environment and the Minister of Foreign Affairs to be in charge of the debate or the dialogue. Right. What's happened? The Americans are looking for to have an open dialogues, not only with the governments, but also with the civil society, with the private sector, etc., subnational players. But the federal government didn't invite these players to sit at the table. Okay, so what's happened today? You have the federal government, Bolsonaro staff, offering proposals to go into to have an agreement to tackle deforestation. Yesterday, they present a new plan with new targets, consider deforestation in Amazonia, that Bolsonaro is committed to reduce deforestation next year, the last year of his government, and this rate will be higher than the lowest rate when the government began. So It's impressive that the guy is able to reaffirm how guilty he is. Right. Okay. But the other side that what's happened, the Americans opened the dialogue with different players of the civil society and also private sector, with subnational players like governors of Amazon, looking for to understand better the big picture. So I think that the next week, what we have, Bolsonaro will go there, will present the Brazil visions, based on his interests or his government interests, like Amazon plan to tackle deforestation, like low carbon agriculture plan to mitigate carbon emissions, also other interests that would like to arrange to say, I'm committed to go and to put in practice climate change, to raise ambition, consider NDCs, Brazil NDCs. And the other side of the coin shows that this is not consistent, as we need to have an agreement. So probably, in my opinion, there are so many cookies into the room, into the kitchen. I know this, but the doors will be open, as this will be the first step to try to establish a new agreement, a new cooperation with Brazil, because it's not only Brazil in Amazon. You have Colombia, you have Peru, and you have Ecuador also close to the Americans to looking for to have this agreement. We'll have an agreement. I believe that we have an agreement. Okay? Even if we can have a short-term agreement, okay? Something like this is something like a seed agreement. Let's sit, have a common understanding, common interest. You know how to do this. It's an open gate, like how we can try to support the subnational players, etc., etc. But the robust agreement that you need to have Brazil back, not only considering to tackle deforestation, but how Brazil will perform, review its NDCs and perform climate change in the next 10 years or the next 20 years, we need to sit again at the table, to have new adults into the room, if you allow me, okay, to bring other players, to have an open debate, to make clear what is the vision of Brazil vision, what Brazil wants, and how Brazil wants to manage its agenda after Bolsonaro.
Okay, Isabella, thank you. That couldn't be clearer. That couldn't be clearer. I'm now going to go to Harjeet. Harjeet, I know you've worked, I know you're the climate lead for ActionAid, so you've got a view across the waterfront. And I suppose the thing I'm really interested in Arjun is that there are two things that make people nervous about COP26, I suppose, the two big things. One is these NDCs, the nationally defined determined contributions. Are they just too little, too late? And also Western funding of adaptation and mitigation in developing economies. And I just wondered whether you'd give your judgment on where things sit now.
Thank you, James, for having me. Great to have participating in this panel. To respond to your question, I would say on both fronts, right now it looks very disappointing because what UK government is pushing countries to agree, yes, on one hand, talking about increasing their pledges and making sure that they are in line with the 1.5-degree target, but at the same time talking about net zero, which is full of loopholes, which is full of issues and depending on negative emission technologies, which we all know are quite uncertain, unproven, and can cause massive damage to livelihoods of people in the global south. And, making a very high pitch around net zero is not going to help. In fact, it's going to undermine efforts where we should be talking about real emission reductions as part of NDCs. That's one. On finance, which is absolutely connected to raising ambition, if we do not see money coming in and the real money coming in, and that's a very important point, because you'll see all kinds of calculations coming saying, we are very close to achieve $100 billion target, which we all know was supposed to be public finance. It is supposed to be leveraging trillions of dollars and not to be the end all of the entire climate finance. It is supposed to help developing countries leverage and access trillions of dollars, and that's what is required. So on both fronts, we are not going in the right direction. UK government, when it comes to finance, is too much obsessed with private financing, which has a value, but let us understand it's only going to talk about mitigation or where they can make money, where there's business sense. When it comes to adaptation, which is a public good, which is about helping people retrofit their houses or building dikes or developing new seeds, all that, we need public investment and public infrastructure. And that requires public financing coming from the global north, which is not happening.
So sorry, Haji, forgive me for interrupting. My wife has a T-shirt which says "I cheat at yoga," which is I've always thought very funny. But if I understand it right, you're saying that we're cheating at climate change on two fronts: that net zero is a cheat, and that the 100 billion is a cheat, right? In terms
Absolutely.
So can you just help us out with that? Because people like me bandy around the phrase net zero and think that's a good thing. So what's the problem with the net zero target as it's applied?
Well, scientifically speaking, it makes a lot of sense. Basically, what we are saying, what we are emitting, you also need to create sinks or a way so that you can absorb all the carbon or all greenhouse gases, so that you are so-called carbon neutral. So that's another way of saying you're carbon neutral. So IPCC has said it. Paris Agreement talks about that balance. Not exactly the term net zero, but balance of emissions and sinks. And IPCC talks about reducing emissions to the extent of 45% by 2030 and becoming carbon neutral by 2050. And that's why the whole world is talking about it. But if you look at the targets that are being announced, they are being announced with keeping 2050 in mind. It's too far. We are talking of several generations in between. Yeah. What does that mean? When I say generations, I also mean political generations who have a shelf life of 4 years and 5 years. So people who are committing, you can't even hold them accountable.
Sorry, Haji, let me just interrupt. So is your complaint about the net zero target that it's 2050?
That's just one part of it.
Okay, that I get. I don't fully understand what your net zero complaint is, that we're not specific about what net zero means?
What net zero means, what does it entail? Whether we are talking about real emission reductions, or the reality is all the big companies, so your Shells and Exxons of the world, and all many major economies, they're talking about net zero because they're heavily relying on new technologies that are going to come up and are going to suck the carbon out of atmosphere, using scientific methods or depending on geoengineering, so that you don't have to change your lifestyle, but you suck that carbon from the atmosphere.
But sorry, let me just understand something. Is if you emit a ton of carbon and then you dig a hole and you bury that carbon in the hole, 1 ton, are you in your mind net zero?
That's the technical definition. But then you also have to look at what does that entail? With what technology are you using? Are you depending on nature, or are you depending on technologies that are not yet there or not yet proven? What is going to be the side effect of when you store that? Because there's also talking about storing that carbon in oceans. How it is going to change that ecosystem? We do not have scientific studies that say that it's all safe. So we are basically not tackling the elephant in the room, which is about emission reductions, which is about changing our lifestyle, which is about changing our consumption patterns. We don't want to tackle that. So we are finding ways to avoid that elephant in the room, and depending on technologies that are going to help us do that. I think the reality is we have to reduce our absolute emissions, and we are not talking about that enough, because policymakers have economy in their mind, left, right, and center. I think that's the major problem.
All right, and Harjit, just on your second cheat, the 100 billion cheat, your point is they've begun to mix private and public capital rather than have the 100 billion in full as public capital.
Not just that, they're also including loans and guarantees into that, which means they'll give you a loan, they'll count it as part of 100 billion. The fact is they're going to get that money with interest, and next year they'll give you that money once again and again count it as part of 100 billion, because 100 billion is supposed to go out every year starting 2020, which has not happened. And it's just a drop in the ocean. I think that's another thing that we have to recognize.
Okay, all right. Well, can I do this? I'm going to just invite my colleague Barney to try and talk through, and it's particularly, I think, the 2 central slides, Barney, the business as usual slide and the one on national NDCs, that would be helpful. And then what I'd like to do is bring in some of the people who made comments along the way. Barney, why don't you just talk us through those 2 middle slides?
Yeah, absolutely. So Harjit has brought some of this up already. But if we just move along to the second slide there. So as you can see, under current pledges, we're in a situation where it would look like there's 2.6 degrees of warming by the end of the century. And that's an estimation that's put together by Climate Action Tracker, which is an NGO that looks at this, that measures the NDCs, the pledges that each country makes towards the COP goals of emissions reductions. But yes, as you can see, under current policies, as well as a separate line there, which looks at what governments have actually implemented. So not just what they pledged, but what they've implemented in terms of carbon pricing, various other measures that bring down the amount of emissions. And then if we just move on to the next slide, please. So as you can see, this is the table as it stands now in terms of what contributions have been submitted to COP in the last year. The deadline for this was 5 years after the Paris Agreement. So this was last year. All nations were supposed to submit a new upgraded nationally determined contribution. But as you can see, the top 3 emitters in the world, China, the US, and India, have yet to have submitted an NDC so far. There's talk that China has said that it intends to, likewise with the US, but we've yet to see any action there yet. So it's a question as to whether we will see that in the run up to COP. And then you can also see there lower on the table some of the countries there that have actually submitted a lower ambition according to Climate Action Tracker than the contribution that they submitted 5 years ago. So yeah, that's a lot to think about there.
I mean, the thing, just sticking with that for 1 second, it is really useful, isn't it? Because you see, I mean, just to echo Isabella's point, China, India, Brazil, South Africa, that is quite a significant chunk of the answer there, and speaks exactly to that Copenhagen to Paris point that Isabella was making. I'm gonna bring in, if I might, a number of people who've made comments and points along the way. If it's all right, I wanted to see if I could bring in Jenny King, Jenny, are you there? Let me see, I'm trying to find you. I'm looking on the gallery view and
Yeah, I'm here.
there you are. I tell you what's great about looking on the gallery view, by the way, Jenny, is I'm noticing some of my colleagues have managed to get haircuts. I obviously haven't, but you know, it's nice to see who's managed to get a booking. So Jenny, tell us what you think, because you made a long point in the chat about a much more systemic set of changes.
Yeah, so I work at an organization called the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, who look internationally at issues around extremism, hate, polarization, and we have a very, very big infrastructure running social media research and looking particularly at, you know, disinformation campaigns, how that impacts major events like the US presidential elections, the EU elections, and we are now running 2 climate-based projects across 7 European countries. And I think that there is an underestimation of how much the granular policy discussion is subsumed into a much bigger culture war debate that is playing out across a number of contexts, certainly within the EU, certainly within North America, but to a greater or lesser extent in other regions as well, which really boils down to average citizens' appetite for any sort of government edicts on how they should live their lives. And in particular, what we're seeing is grievance from the COVID-19 pandemic and a sense of resentment around the lockdowns and the other containment measures that have been implemented by governments being pivoted into fear-mongering around a future green agenda. And so while the kind of progressive movement is rightly pushing this narrative and language around, you know, we need bold action, we need to have a new era, we need to build back better, this needs, you know, we need to use the pandemic as a prompt and an impetus for us to really change the whole paradigm of how we're thinking about climate change. That also plays perfectly into the kind of far-right conspiracy media world and also extremist groups who believe that the pandemic was a kind of test case or a crucible for governments to try out authoritarian actions, and that the green agenda is a perfect way to mobilize that at an international level and to create multilateral agendas that infringe on civil liberties, you know, take away your ability to eat meat, stop you from being able to have international holidays, take away your diesel cars. And within that, nested within it, there's also a narrative that we've seen coming up a lot, which is around equity and fairness. Yeah. And that has played out in COPs previously, but it's usually been around sort of inverted commas, global north, global south countries, and the idea of differentiated responsibility and historic responsibility around mitigating climate change. But now we're seeing it play out even within countries like the UK or Germany, where any attempt to talk about climate policies comes back to this idea that it's always disadvantaged communities who bear the brunt of action, and that climate in general is an elitist agenda. Yeah,
Jenny, it's a very interesting thing. I mean, just to blow the trumpet of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue, it's done, I think, really interesting and impressive work on hate speech and the whole kind of murky world of the alt-right online. I guess the thing that I just wanted to understand from you is when you say that you're starting to do some work on this, it wouldn't naturally strike me as ISD kind of work. So what's the thing that you're looking at? Are you looking at organization online around anti-climate?
So we take a two-pronged approach. I mean, what we've tried to build throughout this project is actually an architecture for the climate sector itself to have live monitoring of how conversation around climate issues is playing out across a range of social media platforms. So rather than working towards, you know, one report that gives you a snapshot, we're actually looking at how can the climate sector know what narratives are emerging and where the threshold is for when they should be concerned and why they should be concerned.
So if you develop a sort of if they get a conspiracy theory around hydrogen, for example, I'm just making this up,
Yeah.
but they could monitor the movement of public sentiment around something like that.
Exactly. So you can look at that in two ways. Either you can take a known group of what we would call adversaries in this context. So you treat it almost like opposition research. So we could take, that could be anything from corporate linked entities, PR bodies that we know are acting on behalf of oil and gas companies. It could be, in the UK context, people like James Dellingpole or Piers Corbyn, committed climate deniers, or those who are pushing kind of climate delay narratives. And that becomes a network of interest. And what you can do is you just monitor everything that's being discussed within those communities, and you consider that to be a bellwether of what might end up penetrating the mainstream.
And Jenny,
or the other way is that you take a narrative-based approach, and that's really what we're building out in relation to COP26. So you would look at stuff like, net zero, climate lockdown, climate hysteria, specific things around green hydrogen and blue hydrogen, which is a massive, massive issue of concern for the sector. The idea that hydrogen is going to be used as a greenwashing technique, so an alternative to fossil fuels. And we can then look across all social media at any conversation around those topics and break it down into a more granular analysis of, what's being discussed, which URLs are most popular, where people are getting their information from, etc.
Okay, Jenny, that's really interesting. We should probably, just as a newsroom, get in touch with ISD and think about how we look at that as a potentially interesting story to follow. There were a couple of other people I wanted to bring in before I come back to Isabel, and Isabel in particular. John D. Now I'm going to use John D. But are you there, John?
I am.
Yes, there you are.
Yep.
John, I was interested in the point you made in the chat. Do you want to just sort of spell it out?
Yeah, we're the architects of things in the UK like Recycle Now and Love Food Hate Waste that can dramatically impact behaviors at scale. And one of my when we've run roundtables continuously with people over the last 10 years, and the general view is that the public will to act, the government will to act is comparatively low, and that the only way of securing real change is if we assume that government change is not going to happen, and that the energy for real change comes from business, from NGOs, from communities, and from individuals. And if you look at the way we're thinking, we're spending too much time, I think, exploring the focus on COP rather than the fact that COP is simply a small milestone on a longer journey. And the opportunity, I think, is to move. We're underestimating the potential of engaging citizens on their terms here and now, rather than talking about emissions. It would be much more interesting to make this something that is immediate, because the climate events and the climate impacts are happening now. So let's make it current, let's make it conversational, let's make it accessible.
Very interesting. We had one of these thinkings last year with David Miliband, who was making a really similar point, John, which was sometimes you get in the situation where, there are only three kinds of actors. There's government, there's business, and there's the public. And it's often the case, and in this case, the government might be well behind the other two. Which sort of echoes that point. I just wanted to bring in David Wood, because David, you made a couple of interesting points. One was, I suppose, as Jenny was talking about the Gilets jaunes and the, trying to get to the end of the month, end of the world conversation that, happened there. But I'm also was struck by your more positive note around vaccines.
So it's true that there has been a lot of pushback against vaccines and government-imposed policies, but it seems that in the UK, at least, people who were initially skeptical and fearful of vaccinations have large parts been persuaded by quite good public messaging campaigns. We've had representatives from multiple communities speaking out, showing themselves being vaccinated. And so I think it does come down to how do we communicate? And I think this is our real challenge. We need to communicate scientifically, but we also need to communicate emotionally, and people need to feel confident that there are people like them who are leading the way. So I'm currently reading a book by an Australian author. I think her name is Catherine Henderson. I'm just double checking frantically. And it's all about the same principle that we need to improve the caliber of the emotional intelligence with which we communicate. And if we can do it in a way that gives people some confidence, then maybe we can have this positive groundswell, which will encourage our politicians to act. I'm quite encouraged by what the Biden administration is doing.
Yes.
Also quite encouraged by what the UK government might do, because although there are many things we can complain about the UK government, they do seem to have some serious attempt to put a stamp on the world in terms of green credentials.
David, thank you. Isabel, can I go back to you and Isabella too, because you touched both on politics, right? And one of the elements of this is generational. And I wondered, Isabel, first, with an eye on China and the politics of China, how much there is a pressure from a younger generation of Chinese people to actually deliver on this change. So, you know, while you may make a point about the references to security versus climate, you know, in the latest, you know, political, you know, circus, the reality is that the generational direction in China is going to force a delivery on the overall commitment.
Yeah, I think, I mean, the politics of China don't really allow for this sort of Greta Thunberg phenomenon.
Yeah.
Or you know, or the Extinction Rebellion. It's just, particularly, we're in a particularly authoritarian moment in China. There was a young a schoolgirl who did try to do the Greta Thunberg thing, but I'm afraid she didn't last very long. So essentially, the impetus at the moment is very much at the kind of top level. Resisted actually by some provinces and cities that, you know, don't want to close down their dirty old industries because they have a financial stake in it. So you have an inverse situation in China where a top-down authoritarian government is trying to figure out how to coerce, you know, reluctant special interests into conforming to the government line.
Mm-hmm.
And so how does that work out? Well, I mean, I just want to go back to this question of mid-century targets or net zero targets and short-term ambition. I mean, when I mentioned the disappointment in the 14th plan, it was because both things are important. The mid-century targets are extremely important because they give you, you know, they give you the Paris ambition, but they're only meaningful if there are meaningful pathways to getting to that mid-century target. And those need to be very robust now. I mean, essentially what we do between now and 2030 is extremely important. And climate change is a wicked problem in that sense, that you know, you're talking about the effects of current actions being far in the future and beyond the lifespan of any current politician. So it's always been a complicated problem. And we are trying to do a very difficult and complicated thing, which is essentially to kind of decarbonize the global economy. Of course, it's going to be difficult. But, you know, if you consider where we are now and where we were 10 years ago, we shouldn't really be too discouraged because we have made enormous progress, and there is a foundation there, and there is a process that we need to keep faith with, and we need to keep moving along, because without it, we really don't have anything. So, you know, I'm sure that this COP will disappoint many, but it's still a better option than no COP at all. And the reason that the COPs matter is that it is the only place where the world gets together and all these arguments about equity, fairness, compensation get thrashed out. And without that, you really get into a kind of beggar my neighbor situation in which, or you know, everyone says, well, they're not doing anything, why should I? So that's why these structures matter. They are the framework against which we can measure each other, and we can shame each other. We can shame the laggards. We can take the example of the leaders.
Yeah,
so we shouldn't lose sight of that, although we of course should be critical.
Yeah. Well, Isabel, just one note. Eve Alcock has made this interesting point in the chat about air pollution. And of course, there was a period where the politics of air pollution in China, even in Beijing, got very interesting. Has Xi Jinping's authoritarianism had an impact on that?
Well, before Xi Jinping, actually, there was a kind of general war on air pollution, and that was one of the things that led to climate policies, because if it is one of the things that people really did care about. There was a lot of public pressure. The party got very anxious about it, and if you clean up one effect of cleaning up the air is that on the whole it tends to be climate friendly, because you're closing down sources of air pollution, which are coal-fired power stations and particulate matter from vehicles and so on and so forth. So that along with the investment policy that I described, in which China is mandating electric vehicles, building electric vehicles, investing in batteries, facilitating the technologies, not just for China, but for the rest of the world. So China's ability to manufacture at scale have reduced the cost of renewables in every country to the point where it's cheaper now to build renewables than to build new gas or new coal. So that's, an important contribution.
Isabella, can I do a sort of pendulum swing? I started off this conversation in a mood of deep skepticism about progress, and actually I'm quite struck by what Isabel just said. Actually, let's not lose sight of what's been achieved in the last 10 years. There's rarely been a global political movement that's all driven in the same way at quite such speed. And is it fair to say that in Brazil, regardless of the government of Bolsonaro, the drive of politics, and particularly generational politics, is that you are going to see fundamental commitments on climate?
Yes, you cannot forget that Brazil used to be a leader on climate change. I was, in the beginning of my career, public officer career, was in Rio 92 conference. And where we signed, we agree with the Convention on Climate Change, okay? And I was fully engaged in all the COPs since 92. And it's impressive how my country plays strategically, not only consider the scientific knowledge and also foreign affairs, but also in our environmental policies, sustainable development policies, national policy, public policies in Brazil. My feeling is that what's happened today in Brazil, it's not only a mistake. It's something that a political mistake. We cannot understand. It's our democracy that produced this. We need to understand. But this is not what we are, okay, as society. The Brazilian society fully support more than 88% of Brazilian society support climate change agenda. They do believe that we need to address solutions on climate change. And you are a developing economy. We are not a developed economy. We have inequalities, we have social inequalities. It's a huge country in which climate change is an opportunity to address solutions for our development, for our social inequality, for regional equality, for economic inequality, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that when you go into, and Brazil always was important, used to be a strategic player for multilateral systems. Everything is changing. We have a transition. It's good. Okay, it's a new world. There is no there is no new normal, in my opinion. We want to have new futures. If you have a son today, they will be alive in the end of the century. So the future is today. Come on, everything is different. So my feeling is that I agree with Isabel that COP26, it's not perfect. The multilateral arrangement is not perfect, but it's absolutely important that can have all the rules adopt there in such a way that you can move for a concrete new phase of climate change fighting that put in practice, not one ambition, but how indeed we will address this. And means that we need to put actions, and you need to understand the trade-offs. We need to understand who will be the losers and will be the new winners. What are the new arrangements, for example, in trades, international trade? It's absolutely important to understand it. The new jobs, et cetera, et cetera. And the young people in Brazil fully supported this. Okay, so the new generations, I used to have a special advisor unit during my term in the Ministry of Environment of young people. It was impressive. I learned a lot, okay? And I hope that indeed we can go beyond what we have today to rules of carbon market, Article 6. Brazil, I hope that Brazil will not block the negotiations, okay? We need to move forward. We have to need the agreements. And don't forget, when you go into implementation, this means that we need to invite other players into the room. They are not the Minister of Environment that will cut emissions. During the negotiation, we have Minister of Environment. Now we have another guys. And these guys must come into the room and show indeed what are the commitments. My last comment, because I know they don't have time and I have to leave. United States should present next week the new NDCs.
Yes.
Okay, the new American NDCs. This will be probably the new bar that to make reference for the new 10 years, or the next 10 years, sorry. It's very important to pay attention if China will react and to propose something new or not. Isabel probably can tell us better than everyone here. And also how the other emerging economies, India will come, and also African countries, to show that you can have probably some short cuts to bring the developing emerging economies, G20 countries together in a common sense, consider climate change commitments the next 10 years. So
Isabel,
I apologize, I have to go. Because
thank you, Isabella. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Okay, thank you. My really honor to join you, and good luck. I hope that you can drink a whiskey in Glasgow.
I hope so too, Isabella.
I don't know it here, but let's see.
Harjit, I'm just going to come to you for one final quick thought. I see that we're at the end of our time, but do you buy the argument that actually the COPs themselves are worth having, or do you think that we're in danger of falling into a trap of performative diplomacy, that we're pretending we're making progress, but it's just so insufficient that we're actually kidding ourselves?
Well, I'm a hardcore internationalist, so I do believe that these forums are absolutely important. The challenge is we have not made them as successful as they should have. And I agree with Isabel quite a lot, except the fact that the climate emergency that people are seeing in the global south is something that we have to take cognizance of, even if we have made huge progress in the last few years, particularly in terms of decarbonization or renewable energy technology. I think it's not that platform that needs to be blamed. There are certain bullies who are misusing that platform and not allowing that progress to happen. Otherwise, UNFCCC is a must platform. United Nations provides equal opportunity to all nations, be it Tuvalu, Bangladesh, India, or the United States. So we must protect this space, but we need to make it more meaningful, more impactful, and more equal than what it is right now.
All right, well, Harjit, thank you. And Isabel, thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. I just want you to know where this goes from here, because I think there are going to be countless conversations this year. I hope that what we will do is try to keep ourselves on track, keep a sense of what's actually happening. I remember an Indian diplomat once told me that the role of the journalist is to track the gap between official reality and reality. And this seems to me a perfect opportunity to do that. I think that, you know, Isabel's account of the mix of what's happened in terms of the prioritization of politics, the export of some of the emissions problem, and that mingling with the Belt and Road, the questions of the short-term delivery that gets you to the long-term target in China is really helpful. I have to say that I thought Isabella's focus on deforestation and the strength of the scientific and civil society communities in Brazil, but if you like, the rather sort of choreographed diplomacy that may happen between Biden and Bolsonaro that won't necessarily mean the meaningful change that's needed, is helpful too. And I think that, Harjit, you press us in a difficult way on this net zero question, because it is really helpful having targets that people can understand and a mechanism that people can understand. But I appreciate you're forcing us to focus on whether or not the promises of future tech are real or causing problems of their own, and whether or not the mix of funding around the 100 billion is sufficient. So both of those things are very, very helpful. A big thank you to Jenny for flagging up an element of this, if you like, a kind of online and a more orchestrated political war than we're probably paying attention to. So we'll look at that. And we're going to bring all of that in. As I say, we'll hold this climate summit. It'll be a full day on this subject on April the 27th. I know that Nigel Topping is going to join us and a whole host of others. So we will then talk about what happens in Glasgow, even in fact, whether it happens in Glasgow on that date. So please do join us then. It will be a moment where we're going to try and pull together a big coalition of people around the accelerating net zero agenda. You'll be glad to hear, Harjit, it's all about getting there faster than 2050. And so with that, we look forward to seeing you then. But for this evening, thank you very much, everyone, for making the time to join us. Have a very good evening.